We begin with the Fox News Alert. I'm Shannon Bream in for Brett Baer. We will not have to wait long to find out who President Trump wants to put on the Supreme Court. Late this afternoon, the president said he will announce his choice July 9th, a week from Monday. He also says he's considering 2 female candidates. Correspondent Kevin Cork is at the White House live for us tonight. Good evening, Kevin.
Good evening, Shannon. You're right. 5 candidates are finalists, a pair of them women, although the president also said he may end up talking to between 5 and 7 people when it's all said and done. We also learned in that conversation with reporters aboard Air Force One, as you pointed out, he will make that selection on July the 9th. And I think it speaks to a couple of things, Shannon. First of all, it tells you he's very confident in the list of candidates, but also he understands the precarious nature of his party's hold on the Senate.
Journalists, like all Americans, should be free from the fear of being violently attacked while doing their job. To the families of the victims, there are no words to express our sorrow for your loss.
And assuming the all-too-familiar role of comforter-in-chief, President Trump today expressed sadness for the victims of the mass shooting in Maryland yesterday that left 5 journalists dead. A tragedy unfolding less than 40 miles from the White House and prompted the solemn beginning of today's otherwise celebratory event, marking 6 months since the passing of historic tax cuts.
We lowered the corporate tax rate so the American worker finally has a level playing field.
But amid the handshakes and backslaps for the booming economy, there also appears to have been a good deal of backroom dealing going on inside the White House last night as the president looked to lock up crucial Senate support for his pending Supreme Court nominee. Republicans have a 51-49 Senate majority, but there are a number of red state Democrats like Joe Manchin, Joe Donnelly, and Heidi Heitkamp, as well as pro-abortion blue state Republicans like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who could ultimately solidify or sink the nominee. All of them met with the president at the White House last night.
Are you going to ask your nominees beforehand how they might vote on Roe versus Wade?
Well, that's a big one, and probably not. They're all saying, don't do that, you don't do that, you shouldn't do that, but I'm putting conservative people on, and I'm going to try and do something like that, but I don't think I'm going to be so specific in the questions I'll be answering.
People united will never be defeated.
The fight on Capitol Hill to prevent the president's pick from being seated is being spearheaded by a host of Democratic 2020 presidential hopefuls.
This is a line that's been drawn about whether we are going to criminalize women, whether we are going to be arresting women for making decisions about their bodies.
We've got 50 years of hard work that's on the line. Women's access to safe legal abortions on the line. What's at stake? The future of America is at stake.
A future that could include a World Trade Organization without the United States. That is, if, as reported by Axios today, the president were to follow through on a desire to withdraw from the organization he previously described as a disaster and unfair to the U.S. But Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin called the Axios report fake news.
And the president has been clear with us and with others. He has concerns about the WTO. He thinks there's aspects of it that are not fair.
The president, by the way, also said aboard Air Force One he has no intention at this point to pull out of the WTO, though he has repeatedly expressed frustration with the organization. And I can tell you one of the things, Shannon, about the high court nominees. A couple of names continue to percolate. We're hearing Messrs. Kavanaugh, Hardiman, and perhaps the Mall, although, as you know, the president can be wildly unpredictable. We'll have to see how things turn out.
Yeah, for now we know it's 1 of 25, Kevin. They've promised us that. Okay, so what is different this time around for this vacancy when it comes to these arguments about Roe v. Wade?
Listen, the last time they wanted to be very careful in how they made their selection. Neil Gorsuch was a very specific type of jurist that the president was looking for. This time, I think White House officials acknowledge they'll be much more careful, not having an overt litmus test, perhaps, for the candidate to be named later. And the reason behind that is you're talking about a very, very close vote on Capitol Hill. If you lose a Murkowski or a Collins because this particular jurist has been on the record, for example, as being against Roe v. Wade, well, that could blow up the whole thing. So I think the White House will be very careful in how they approach that this time around, Shannon.
I think you are exactly right. Kevin Cork live at the White House. Thank you very much. All right, we're learning more tonight about the man accused of using a shotgun to slaughter 5 people at an Annapolis, Maryland newspaper. Authorities say 38-year-old Jared Ramos had a long grudge against the Capital Gazette, and Thursday he acted on it. Correspondent Leah Gabriel has a report tonight from the Maryland Capitol. Good evening, Leah.
Hi, good evening, Shannon. Flags have been at half staff in Maryland today, and here in Annapolis, a sense of both loss and resilience. The man believed to be responsible appeared in court by live video feed today. He wore a jumpsuit with his hands behind his back. He said nothing, and he watched with what some describe as a blank, emotionless stare.
Mr. Ramos is alleged to have executed a brutal series of attacks on innocent victims.
Jared Ramos is charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each victim. This as police try to figure out the question everyone is asking: why?
We did find evidence at the residence. It's evidence showing the origination of planning.
The 38-year-old who was not cooperating with investigators had a long-standing dispute with the paper. It started in 2011 when a columnist wrote about a criminal harassment case against Ramos. He later sued the columnist and the editor and publisher for defamation, but the case was dismissed. Since then, Ramos made threats on social media, but the paper chose not to file charges.
There was a fear that doing so would exacerbate an already flammable situation.
Those threats realized yesterday. Police arriving 1 minute from the first shots. An employee at another business inside the same building describes the moment it all started.
Heard a loud noise, like an incredibly loud bang, and I poked my head around the corner of my desk, and I saw a guy holding a gun.
Police say Ramos, armed with smoke grenades and a shotgun, knew there were 2 entrances and barricaded the back door before going to the front and then shooting people as they tried to escape. The victims: 59-year-old Rob Hyacin, the paper's assistant editor; 61-year-old Gerald Fishman, the editorial page editor; features reporter 65-year-old Wendy Winters; 56-year-old reporter John McNamara; and 34-year-old sales assistant Rebecca Smith. A memorial is growing at the site as the community comes together for the victims and their loved ones, including their co-workers who are persevering through this tragedy. One writing on Twitter last night: "I can tell you this, we are putting out a damn paper tomorrow." This is that paper, the Capital Gazette, honoring their co-workers who were lost by showing that they will not be stopped. There are also a number of vigils here in Annapolis this evening as people mourn the loss of these people. Ramos is being held without bond, and according to the state's attorney, he will be prosecuted by a grand jury. Shannon?
Leah Gabriel in Annapolis, thank you very much. The Homeland Security Department's Inspector General says the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency is failing to comply with detention standards. And a report says inspections of ICE facilities are not consistently thorough and do not fully examine actual conditions or identify all deficiencies. ICE runs more than 200 detention facilities in the U.S. One of the Democrats thought to be in the running to challenge President Trump in 2020 is openly calling for an end to ICE. Meanwhile, protests not far from the northern U.S. border forced one office to close for several days. Correspondent Jillian Turner shows us.
Federal agents have reopened a little ICE office in Portland after 10 days of dramatic protests rocked the community and forced authorities to shut it down. But opposition to ICE is gaining steam among Democrats. Some of the president's most outspoken political opponents, at least one who may be eyeing his job, are now igniting a push to abolish the agency.
It has become a deportation force, and that's why I believe you should get rid of it, start over, reimagine it, and build something that actually works.
New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio also adding his support to the hashtag Abolish ICE campaign just this morning. They may be taking their cues from other Democrats on the far left who are making this issue part of their platform.
It's time to evaluate scrapping the agency and revisiting our immigration system in a way that is humane, safe.
On Capitol Hill, where Ocasio-Cortez hopes to land come November, some of her would-be colleagues are already a step ahead.
The bill that we are introducing would have a commission to look at those essential functions, which there are, of ICE.
Wisconsin Congressman Mark Pocan claims at least 5 other Democratic lawmakers have already signed on. Even ICE agents are calling for reform. 19 special agents in charge of Homeland Security investigations are calling for ICE to be split up into 2 separate organizations. They claim ICE is outdated and tell the Secretary of Homeland Security ICE has considerable challenges creating singular policies, programs, training plans, staffing templates, or budget prospectus. But President Trump insists ICE is needed now more than ever before to protect America's security interests.
You know what would happen to parts of our country? It would be overrun with the worst criminal elements you have ever seen.
While Democrats are united in their opposition to President Trump's immigration policies, DNC Chair Tom Perez insists the party is divided when it comes to abolishing ICE altogether. Either way, changes are coming to the embattled agency. Today's acting director, Jim Holman's last day in office, and he's going out guns blazing, saying he's sickened by the attacks he's seen on his agency. Shannon?
Jillian, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mexico's presidential election Sunday could have major ramifications here in the U.S. National correspondent William Lajeunesse tells us why tonight from Mexico City.
The frontrunner to lead Mexico is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, a far-left populist whose campaign is sweeping Mexico.
Obrador leads a coalition called Together We Will Make History. Well, Wednesday night he did, here in the largest stadium in Latin America, in Mexico City, where he was once mayor and is likely to become the next president of Mexico.
He's polling at 52% right now. Nobody expected a candidate to poll above 30%. I mean, he's blowing the traditional two-party system completely out of the water.
Mexico is currently run by the center-right PRI party, whose voters appear to have rejected, along with the National Action Party.
The policies are actually secondary. What is really important is the nature of the man.
AMLO is the grandson of a farm worker. He began his political career building houses for Mexico's indigenous poor and led environmental protests. 4 years ago, he started his own political party.
His election is going to make life a lot more complicated for the United States.
Obrador says he won't fight America's drug war. Instead, he'll give amnesty to opium and marijuana growers and cease using the military against the cartels.
López Obrador sees militarization and the use of the armed forces as something that has exacerbated the problem of violence.
Obrador favors renegotiating NAFTA and says he will defend the rights of, quote, migrants of the world who, by necessity, must abandon their towns to find life in the United States. It's a human right we will defend. A nationalist, Obrador says Mexico won't be America's piñata.
And when Andrés Manuel says we're not your piñata, what it means is we need to talk like equals.
So the latest polls before a dark period show Obrador with a sizable lead with support from the working poor and the young. So the question is he going to govern as he campaigned as a left-wing nationalist or as a pragmatist as he has tried to reassure business? As for the U.S., most analysts predict a rocky road ahead with President Trump. Shannon?
William Lajeunesse in Mexico City, thank you. New austerity measures are looming for storm-battered Puerto Rico after local legislators refuse to alter labor laws as demanded by a federal control board. The board says the changes would stimulate the U.S. territory's economy amid an 11-year recession. The board overseeing the island's finances says it will eliminate a $25 million scholarship fund for Puerto Rico's largest public university and a $50 million fund for cities and towns struggling in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Up next, last night's debate between Republicans who want to be Florida's next governor centers on which candidate has deeper Florida roots. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 25 in Boston as the Massachusetts Senate passes a bill raising the minimum age for purchasing cigarettes and other tobacco or vaping products from 18 to 21. The bill could help bring the entire state in line with a policy already adopted by many cities and towns there. Fox 40 in Sacramento as Californians get the chance to vote in November on whether the state should move towards stopping the twice-yearly process of changing the clocks. A bill signed Thursday by Governor Jerry Brown will put a measure on the ballot moving the state toward permanent daylight savings time. Passage by voters would not immediately stop the practice, but it gives lawmakers the power to make the change if Congress allows it. And this is a live look at Miami from WSVN. One of the big stories there tonight, a SpaceX rocket that flew just 2 months ago roared back into action today. launching the first orbiting robot with artificial intelligence and other station supplies. The used Falcon rocket blasted off before dawn, hauling nearly 3 tons of cargo for the crew of the International Space Station. That is tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. The debate over who should be the Republican nominee for governor in Florida this fall is centering on which candidate is more Florida than the other. Correspondent Peter Ducey looks at last night's debate scene right here on Fox.
Hours after Congressman Ron DeSantis landed in Orlando following a morning on Capitol Hill, the Agriculture Commissioner Adam Putnam tried to portray his competition for governor as an out-of-towner.
I just want to say, welcome to Florida, Congressman.
In the spin room, after an hour on stage, Putnam doubled down.
You shouldn't have to have a map or a GPS to find your way. And you need to be focused on Florida issues.
But DeSantis argues a distaste for D.C. is a new concept for his opponent.
This is a guy that's been in office since he was 22 years old. And oh, by the way, he spent a decade in Washington.
And the congressman shrugged off complaints that all his high-profile hearings on the Hill are filling his campaign account with too many donations from outside of Florida.
With Florida, you got to understand, there's a lot of people who spend half the year in Florida, so they have an interest in doing that. Donald Trump himself spends a lot of time in Florida. He's not necessarily a Florida resident.
The part-time Palm Beach resident, President Trump, cast a long shadow over this debate.
I look forward to campaigning with him as governor of Florida.
But DeSantis, who has the president's endorsement, points out Putnam wasn't helpful to Trump in 2016.
You couldn't find Adam Putnam if you had a search warrant.
Another signal that the national dialogue may dominate this summer's state-level races. Both candidates condemned a Democratic member of Congress who represents a district 2,500 miles away.
I'm leading the fight right now in Congress to censure Maxine Waters.
They ought to look at some of the things that Maxine Waters has said over the years.
The old adage, all politics is local, may not apply everywhere this year because the priority in this primary so far has been to establish support for President Trump's policies, even the ones that don't have a direct connection to the state. Shannon?
Yeah, who's more MAGA? All right, Peter Ducey down in Florida, thank you very much. A federal judge has blocked Kentucky's work requirements for Medicaid and has ordered the Trump administration to reconsider the program. The judge ruled the administration did not adequately consider whether the work requirements and other changes would help the state give its residents access to health care. He calls the administration's decision arbitrary and capricious. Stocks were up. The Dow gained 55. The S&P 500 finished ahead 2. NASDAQ rose 7. For the week, the Dow lost 1.25 percentage points. The S&P 500 dropped 1 1/3. NASDAQ fell 2 1/3. For the first half of the year trading, the Dow is down about 2. The S&P 500 has gained 1 2/3. NASDAQ is up almost 9 percentage points. Now to a fascinating story. It seems that while the Holocaust is etched indelibly on the collective psyche of the world and its history, it is not on the minds or even in the minds of many millennials. Tonight, correspondent Lauren Green on why it's true and what some people are trying to do about it.
The Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews during Nazi Germany's quest for world domination that led to World War II. It's a defining event of the last century, yet a recent study shows American millennials are uninformed about much of it.
You know your history. What happened in April of 1943? Hello?
If you don't know, that's when Jews tried to stage an uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. You're not alone. Learning details like this is the point of an intense conference in New York City, where the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous is trying to turn the tide of Holocaust ignorance by teaching teachers. According to a study by Schoen Consulting, 66% of millennials could not identify Auschwitz, the Nazis' largest concentration camp.
That fact that millennials do not know about the Holocaust says something about the educational system. You're wondering, what are the teachers teaching? What are the students learning?
The Germans went village to village, forcing Jews to go into the ghetto. The Gestapo came to take my cousin Sylvia, her brother and her parents to the ghetto.
Humanizing the Holocaust is a big part of the 5-day course. Speakers include experts and survivors.
When it's taught in history class, it's glossed over when they teach World War II, and they don't really go in depth with it. So I've gotten some new perspectives as far as how to approach it and kind of turn the question around and analyze it differently.
You do your best to use the Holocaust as an example of what can happen if people make choices that are the wrong choices, and what can happen if people make choices that are the right choices. What can happen when people stand up in the face of evil.
It is because of the Holocaust that the phrase crimes against humanity was created. The yearly conference works to ensure that we never have to create another one. Shannon.
Lauren Green, thank you. Very important story. Well, the Iowa Supreme Court has struck down a law requiring a 72-hour waiting period for women seeking an abortion. The justices said the restriction was an unconstitutional burden on women. They also noted the waiting period could force delays, increase costs, and in some cases prevent a woman from legally obtaining an abortion. Up next, our Whatever Happened To segment on Benghazi. First, beyond our borders tonight, Vice President Mike Pence is telling the governments of 3 Central American countries they must do more to stop migrants who enter the U.S. illegally. Pence said, quote, "The exodus must end." He spoke with the leaders of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala Thursday in Guatemala City. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met today with Saudi Arabia's energy minister as the U.S. pushes for its Gulf allies to increase oil supplies. It's part of the administration's effort to isolate Iran by hurting its oil industry. The European Union issued a stark assessment of the gridlocked Brexit talks today, saying there's been no substantial progress on the key issue of the Irish border. The union is advising its member nations to ramp up their preparations for the possibility that Britain could crash out of the bloc without a deal. Just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back. In tonight's Whatever Happened To segment, the Benghazi story. The events in Libya almost 6 years ago and in Washington ever since cost lives, shaped history, and influenced the political fortunes of some very important people. Here's special report anchor Brett Baer.
September 11th, 2012, 11 years after the 9/11 attacks, a mob storms the U.S. compound in Benghazi. At the end of the night, 4 Americans are dead. Sean Smith, Ambassador Chris Stevens, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty.
The United States condemns in the strongest terms this outrageous and shocking attack.
The Obama administration promised to bring the killers to justice, but during the election year, administration officials and the president himself refused to say for days whether the brutal attack was planned or an act of terrorism.
Do you have any regrets about producing the film?
Instead, at first, placing the blame squarely on an anti-Muslim video made by an American.
The best information and the best assessment we have today. This is a response to a hateful and offensive video. It began spontaneously in Benghazi, a direct result of a heinous and offensive video that was widely disseminated. This is something we've seen in the past.
We would later learn the comments by then United Nations Ambassador Susan Rice on all 5 Sunday talk shows were met with shock by State Department employees, but those comments were backed up by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who maintained it was unclear at the time what was behind the attack. Later, an email she wrote to her daughter surfaced, an email written within hours of the assault that makes no mention of the video and instead blames a, quote, al-Qaeda-like group.
This was the fog of war. My own assessment careened from, the video had something to do with it, the video had nothing to do with it.
Fox News tried to track down the man who made that video, Nakula Basili Nakula. The last time he was interviewed in 2016, he was living in a homeless shelter in California and told Fox News he doesn't believe in democracy anymore. It was the administration's initial blaming the video, the timeline of events that led up to the attack, and word that Ambassador Stevens himself warned that the security situation in Benghazi was deteriorating fast that fueled a host of investigations. The first was the State Department's own 39-page unclassified report that stopped short of implicating Secretary of State Clinton for any wrongdoing, but did find a breakdown in senior leadership, and 4 employees were taken off the job for several months before being reassigned.
We fixed it at the Assistant Secretary level, which is, in our view, the appropriate place to look, where the decision-making, in fact, takes place, where, if you like, the rubber hits the road.
8 congressional committees would investigate the breakdown in Benghazi over 4 years.
Was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk one night who decided they'd go kill some Americans? What difference at this point does it make?
House Select Committee on Benghazi Chairman Trey Gowdy says his committee set out to seek answers, not to be involved in the politics of it.
I wanted to both debunk myths to the extent there were myths out there about what we were doing there and what Chris Stevens was doing there, but more than anything else, I wanted to at least be able to tell Chris Stevens and Sean Smith and Ty Woods and Glenn Doherty's loved ones, this is what happened that night, the early morning hours, to your loved one, and it is a story of heroism that you should be eternally proud of.
Republicans on the committee released their findings in June of 2016 without the endorsement of Democrats during the heat of Hillary Clinton's presidential run.
There's a special place in hell for people like her, and I hope she enjoys it there.
The parents of victims Sean Smith and Ty Woods have been vocal about placing blame on Hillary Clinton for the failures in Benghazi and sued the former Secretary of State, alleging negligence and defamation. In March, a D.C. court reaffirmed an earlier court's decision to dismiss those claims.
I've totally forgiven everyone that's involved with the death of my son.
As for bringing those directly responsible for the deaths of 4 Americans to justice, almost 2 years after the Benghazi terror attacks, a suspect is now in custody. Special forces captured the man believed to be the ringleader of the attack, Ahmed Abu Hattala, in 2014, a man who had been hiding in plain sight for months.
It's important for us to send a message to the world that when Americans are attacked, no matter how long it takes, we will find those responsible, and we will bring them to justice.
Wednesday, Hattala was sentenced to 22 years in prison after being found guilty last November on just 4 of the 18 counts he faced. Late last year, President Trump announced the capture of a second suspect, Mustafa al-Imam, saying he will face justice for his role in the attack. Al-Imam has pleaded not guilty. Today, if you go to the FBI website, they're still asking for information about individuals who may have been on the grounds on the mission in Benghazi when it was attacked. Bret Baier, Fox News.
We now know when President Trump will announce his pick for the Supreme Court. We'll get some thoughts from the panel on who it might be when we come back.
We will begin our search for a new justice of the United States Supreme Court that will begin immediately. And hopefully we're going to pick somebody who will be as outstanding. We have to pick a great one. We have to pick one that's going to be there for 40 years, 45 years. We need intellect. We need so many things to go. You know, there's so many elements go into the making of a great justice of the Supreme Court. You got to hit every one of them.
Well, let's talk about it with our panel, because now we know when this is allegedly going to happen. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. And David Katniss, senior politics writer for U.S. News and World Report. Great to see all of you. All right, so Steve, today he says July 9th. It's a week from Monday. We know because they've had this list for a long time. He's already interviewed some of these folks. But that's kind of like rocket docket material to pick a justice in a week and a half.
Yeah, well, I think they're working back from the fall. I mean, Mitch McConnell's made very clear that he wants this done. President Trump wants this done by October. Justice seated by October, conceivably. And I think it's a priority. Mitch McConnell's been planning for this moment for years. He's been working with the White House for years. He's cleared much of the Senate schedule to address this and other judicial vacancies. We know that this is Mitch McConnell's top priority. It's something that he's been looking at doing going back before the election of Donald Trump. So I think Donald Trump is probably wise to move as quickly as he's going to move, and whatever Mitch McConnell can do to accelerate the Senate schedule, he ought to do that too.
Well, not all senators are on board, as we know. Senator Dianne Feinstein, the ranking member, the Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is going to have a lot to do with this. Here's what she says about moving forward.
As you sow, so you reap. And I think we will have a plan, and it will be announced by the Democratic leader at an appropriate time. But this is a very serious situation, and no one should underestimate it.
So, Molly, of course, Democrats are pushing back, saying, well, he said you can't ever hold, you have to fill the seat in an election year. You have to hold it open until after the election. You can't fill it. Mitch McConnell told me last night, well, we meant that in presidential election year. So she says they've got a plan. I don't know what Democrats are planning to do.
And Mitch McConnell didn't just say that last night. He said that throughout 2016. And the question wasn't whether every election year is the same, but whether presidents should have the right to pick their nominee. So whether you think that what Mitch McConnell did in 2016 was a good idea or bad, he was very clear and explicitly clear, and so were the people who supported his plan, that that was about presidential election years. Democrats are in a really tough place right now, though. There are Republicans who might go squishy on a nominee from Donald Trump, but you have a lot of Democrats who are running in states that Donald Trump won overwhelmingly, who will have voters livid if they do not support any qualified candidate that Donald Trump puts forth.
We think about the Joe Manchins of the world and others, David, that we're watching. It's a very small list, but it could be enough to make a difference. One of the big issues that was immediately jumped on by the left is this idea of Roe v. Wade. Justice Kennedy had been protective of abortion rights, that kind of thing. And so, replacing him, you say it's a Republican president replacing a Republican nominee, but it could be very different in his case on these social issues. I want to play something that now President Trump said during the debate in October of 2016 with our Chris Wallace, when he was asked specifically about whether or not he'd look for someone to overturn Roe v. Wade or whether that would happen.
But what I'm asking you, sir, is do you want to see the court overturn? You just said you want to see the court protect the Second Amendment. Do you want to see the court overturn Roe v. Wade?
Well, if we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices on, that's really what's going to be, that will happen. And that'll happen automatically, in my opinion, because I am putting pro-life justices on the court. I will say this, it will go back to the states, and the states will then make a determination.
All right, David.
So he actually said today, I shouldn't say that. He was asked today at the gaggle, and he said, I'm not going to ask these potential nominees about Roe versus Wade, because now he's getting on script saying, I shouldn't, you don't want to be pinned down on that and then have the nominee go in the hearing and be asked. But look, this is going to be the Alamo for the left. Just the statements coming out from the potential 2020 Democratic senators, whether it be Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, there's a feeling among Democrats that although Republicans had the power, that Barack Obama and Democrats never fought hard enough for Merrick Garland. And the left wants a fight on this. Now, the Republicans have the votes, and I think eventually President Trump will get his nominee, but it is not going to be without a hellfire fight this fall from the left, because they are, I mean, this is about Roe v. Wade, this is about choice, this is about everything, and I just think there's going to be a bigger fight than expected.
Well, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, it is widely regarded that Roe v. Wade is just a really horribly reasoned legal decision. So the question isn't really about whether you support Roe v. Wade or not. Even people who are pro-choice recognize that it was a poorly argued judicial decision. But the question really will be about your approach to the law. Are you an originalist on questions of the Constitution? Are you a textualist on questions of the law? You don't need to ask about Roe v. Wade because, again, so many people regard it as just such a horribly reasoned.
And we all know, too, that these nominees, when they get in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, if it is something really critical and difficult, they're going to say, I can't answer that because that issue may be coming before me. So everybody's going to be combing through every, comma in their record to see if they can find a clue for what they would do.
And just watch the 2 female senators, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Susan Collins. That's why you're going to see a lot of pressure on them. You're going to see Democrats, additionally to them, 2 Republicans, if they could peel them away and say no. I mean, their handling of this process is going to be very interesting, because I don't know where they go. Do they decide to be that vote for justice that could potentially overturn Roe v. Wade? There may be a lot of people that think it's poorly worded, but this is politics, and there's going to be a message from Democrats saying this court, this new Trump court with 2 new Supreme Court justices, will overturn the right to abortion in at least 30 states.
Well, Steve, what you have to do is find someone who's never written an opinion on it or publicly answered a question about it.
But even that, honestly, even that strikes me as optimistic. I mean, the conversation here is sort of sanguine about the possibility of a fight over somebody's actual record and the things that he or she has actually written. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think Democrats, we've seen already, are so hysterical at the prospect of a conservative court that they're saying things that don't bear any resemblance to the truth. I mean, you have Democratic or left-leaning analysts making predictions about, about women's rights and where women are going to be and what they'll have to do. This is crazy. I think that's likely to be the tone throughout this, and the debate, the real debate, is going to be inside the Democratic Party, and it's not necessarily going to be about this position itself. It's all positioning, I think, for 2020.
Well, a lot of folks think that whomever is nominated and confirmed to the bench, if it happens before the midterms, as is the plan, it's only going to drive up the resistance and the Democrats to get out to the polls in the midterms, because they're not going to want to be on the wrong side of this again when it comes to them. Okay, that's it on this topic. But up next, the Friday Lightning Round. We're trying to cover a lot. Democrats versus ICE, Trump versus the WTO, plus winners and losers. Stick around.